I'm standing on the Brig of Balgownie over the River Don in Aberdeen. The river rises in the foothills of the Cairngorms, 60 miles to the west of the city, and ends in the North Sea just half a mile east of us here. The bridge was completed early in the 14th century during the reign of King Robert the Bruce and became part of a strategic highway linking northern and southern parts of his kingdom. At the heart of Robert the Bruce's campaign against the English and against his Scottish opponents was his ambition to control all of Scotland's land. This was the prize for which he was willing to risk his own and many others' lives. The power that comes with controlling land motivated Scots long before Bruce and long after his death. In this film, we look back at some of the key aspects of land ownership in Scotland and at the Scots whose lives have been shaped by the power of the land. For thousands of years, the land of Scotland has been both a physical and a spiritual resource for the people living here. The land has always brought more than just economic benefits. From our Neolithic ancestors to present-day Scots, the land has fed both body and spirit. The great stone circles like Callanish testify to this spiritual dimension of landscape. So do the recumbent stone circles, a Bronze Age variant unique to the northeast of Scotland. This is the recumbent stone circle at Tomnavery near Tarland in Aberdeenshire. The cremated remains of this community's dead were buried inside a large stone cairn which took up most of the central space of the stone circle. It's long since been dismantled and the stones have been used for other purposes. The recumbent stone, wedged in between the two flankers, usually built at the southwest aspect of these stone circles in order to frame the setting sun, represents a symbolic closed doorway to the dead. But this recumbent stone circle is much more than just a very old burial ground. Tomnavery expresses the community's relationship with the land, not just a resting place for the dead, but the very source of life for the small community of Bronze Age farmers who lived here. It was erected on raised ground in order to look out on that land and be seen from it. The enormous effort in erecting it is a statement of collective purpose and meaning. This is not a monument to individual power and control. 4,000 years on from the construction of Tomnavery, every inch of the Scottish landscape has felt some form of human impact. Even the highest summits, the most remote lochs, are wild by design and not by default. And all of this remarkable landscape is owned. Somebody somewhere claims every part of it. Supporters of Scottish land reform today claim that 50% of privately owned land in rural Scotland is owned by less than 500 individuals. This makes it the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Europe. This film looks back at some of the historical events that have helped to shape the present pattern of land ownership. Reforming land ownership is seen as increasingly important by both the Scottish Government and civil society. Can history provide any lessons on how our relationship with the land should be developed in the future? The earliest inhabitants of Scotland expressed a reverence for the land around them. The Neolithic and Bronze Age stone circles testify to this. Many historians and archaeologists believe that in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, much of Scotland's land was organised and managed in what have come to be called farmer republics. These were communities of extended families where the communal working of the land ensured their survival. Over time, the development of more complex societies saw the construction of the Bronze Age brochs and the hill forts of the early Iron Age. They are evidence of the growth of religious and military elites in some societies. But the authority of these elites was limited. They exercised control only in specified circumstances and over people rather than land. Later, when the Romans came to North Britain, they expressed their relationship with the land in a very different way. Hadrian's Wall is the architecture of domination and control. It was built after a protracted period of conflict between the Roman conquerors of southern Britain and their northern neighbours. One dramatic episode in this conflict was Agricola's campaign between 78 and 84 AD, in which Roman legions penetrated into Scotland as far as the Murray Firth. During this war, according to Roman sources, the Caledonians, a confederacy of native people living north of the River Tay, experienced a terrible defeat at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 84. There is still no consensus on the exact location, but the slopes of Benihee here in Aberdeenshire are a strong contender for the site of the battle. Despite Agricola's military victory at Mons Graupius, the Romans did not attempt to permanently garrison the north. When the fighting ended, the legions withdrew south, although a line of forts and watchtowers on the Gask Ridge was maintained for a while. Continuing conflict with the Caledonians led eventually to a more complete Roman withdrawal and the building of Hadrian's Wall between 122 and 128 AD. The wall established a northern frontier between the Roman Empire and the land of barbarians beyond. It's remarkable that 20 years after the construction of Hadrian's Wall, Hadrian's successor as Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius decided to extend the Roman frontier northwards and build a second wall. And we're looking at part of the remains of it here at Rough Castle near Falkirk, the site of one of the Roman forts on the Antonine Wall. The wall stretched 40 miles across Scotland, from the Firth of Clyde in the west to the Firth of Forth in the east. This rampart wall was constructed of stone and turf, a stone foundation with turfs piled on top. This huge defensive ditch was placed on the north side of the wall, and there were 19 forts made of timber and turf along the whole length. On the south side of the wall was a Roman military way which ran parallel to the wall. To defend the northern entrances to some of the forts, including Rough Castle, the Romans dug pit traps. These deep holes held sharpened wooden stakes and were covered and camouflaged to cause maximum death and injury. The Antonine Wall was built to consolidate Roman control over this part of southern Scotland. It replaced the Hadrian's Wall as the new northern frontier for the Romans. It must have had a profound impact on not just the people, but the landscape around it. Barely 20 years after the wall was constructed, it was abandoned by the Romans. They withdrew south and re-established Hadrian's Wall as the northern frontier. The Antonine Wall was just too far from the centres of Roman power in the south and too vulnerable to continuing guerrilla attacks from the north. Defending the Antonine Wall was a lesser priority than the defence of other frontiers in the Roman Empire. Some years later, the empire struck back with a ferocious land and sea campaign waged by the Emperor Septimus Severus. Between 208 and 211, Roman legions again penetrated north. But this campaign ended shortly after Severus died in 211. The Romans withdrew to Hadrian's Wall, which remained the empire's northern frontier. There were other Roman military campaigns in Caledonia in the 4th century against enemies that the Romans had now begun to refer to as Picts. But they had no more long-term success than the earlier campaigns. There were no permanent Roman forts built, not a single Roman villa was constructed. There was no colonization, and the land remained firmly under native control. So did the Romans have any real influence over Caledonia? Some of the northern peoples living closest to the frontiers certainly paid tribute and taxes to Rome, and the Romans in turn paid some of the northern people to keep the peace. More generally, there was cultural exchange in ideas, in skills, and in trade goods. But overall, Roman influence was limited because political control was never established. And because of this, the Romans never exercised direct control over the land. The Romans' most important legacy was probably political. By the 5th century AD, small-scale states in the north had begun to merge into larger states and territories. This process was, in part, a response to the Roman threat. When kingdoms like Pictland and Dalriata developed in the 6th and 7th centuries, control of land was to be the key element in their political progress. The lack of detailed written sources makes it very difficult for historians to reconstruct accurately how the first political kingdoms evolved from earlier small-scale kinship-based communities. Most do seem to agree that political control in kingdoms like Pictland and Dalriata was initially exercised over people rather than over a defined territory. The power and authority of the rulers of these kingdoms was based upon the payment of tribute by members of their community. In an era before money, this was in the form of cattle, cheese, grain, and other produce. There was also an obligation to perform military service in war bands and naval galleys. The Kingdom of Dalriata provides some of the earliest written evidence for the development of centralised power in Scotland. The Senecas Fernalpin is a 10th century Irish manuscript based on a much earlier census of the people of Argyll in the 7th century. It records that every household in Islay owed services to their ruler. Although no written records like the Senecas have survived in Pictland, it is believed that the Pictish kingdom probably developed in this way too. The Pit place names today reveal the location of Pictish farming settlements. But the Pit or Pet was part of a larger estate and paid tribute in the form of agricultural produce. Archaeological evidence from the Rhynie Dig near Huntly has revealed that by the middle of the 5th century, a high-status Pictish power centre had developed here. It probably received tribute from a number of settlements in the area. When St Columba met the Pictish king Brythei in 565, possibly at Craigfatrick in Inverness, northern Pictland already had a king who ruled dependent territories, including Orkney. The existence of a wealthy warrior elite in Pictland is clearly shown on many of the Pictish Class II stones. In the Kingdom of Alba, which developed from the union of Pictland and Dalriata, elite structures were present from the start. The Gaelic term Morver, meaning Great Steward, describes a position second only in status to the King of Alba. The Kingdom of Alba also borrowed the Anglo-Saxon word Thane to describe a key role below that of the Morver. So, long before the introduction of feudalism in Scotland, hierarchical political structures were already well developed. The Kingdom of Alba provides some early evidence of how rulers assessed tribute from the people who lived and worked on their land. In Alba, the davach evolved as a key unit of land assessment, although its origins may be Pictish. A davach was an area of land comprising several settlements and communities who owed tribute to their rulers. The first written reference to a davach comes in the 12th century Gaelic notes in the Book of Deer. The Book of Deer is one of Scotland's oldest manuscripts, a 10th century gospel book written by the monks of Deer Abbey, a monastery established in Pictish times near Peterhead in Buchan. We're standing in the grounds of the later 13th century Deer Abbey, which replaced and succeeded the old monastery. The Gaelic notes reveal that the abbey received a grant of 2 davachs of land from the King of Alba, Malcolm II, early in the 11th century. Unusually, they didn't have to pay any tribute on the produce of this land. A century later, when King David I became King of Scotland, the monks petitioned him in order to maintain control of the land and their privileges. The rulers of Alba seem to have played a key role in the consolidation of davach boundaries. Recent research has suggested that davachs were not simply a measure of arable production, but deliberately encompassed a wide range of natural resources. Rivers, woodland, upland and mountain pasture, and in some areas the coastline. The origins of the davach may lie in the fact that it helped communities to exploit common resources more effectively and helped to avoid conflict. Over time, its boundaries were fixed to ensure that communities had guaranteed access to a wide range of natural resources. The evolution of the davach reflected the needs of communities rather than a specific sector or interest. The development of the Davach suggests underlying patterns of communal management of the land, but it also highlights the way in which control was already passing from the people to their rulers long before the 12th century. When David I became King of Scots in 1124, he brought some very new ideas on how land should be controlled and managed. Scotland was about to enter the age of feudalism. Feudalism was the political and social system which had developed in Normandy and was imposed on England after the Norman military conquest in 1066. The Scottish experience was very different. Feudalism developed directly under the control of Scottish kings. David I, King of Scots between 1124 and 1153, had spent his formative years at the court of the English King Henry I, where he experienced England's feudal system at first hand. David and his immediate successors were responsible for the introduction of the first phase of feudalism in Scotland after 1124. David embraced the feudal principle that the king owned all the land, and that the great landowners derived their land from the king, to whom they owed allegiance as vassals. Under David and his successors, legal charters were granted to the existing Gaelic lords, like the Earls of Fife, Strathearn and Mar. New lordships were also created for Flemish, Norman and English knights who were offered land mainly in the south and east of Scotland in return for military and other services. In this way, the Norman family of Robert the Bruce were granted the lordship of Annandale in present-day Dumfries and Galloway. Grants of land were also given to monasteries, abbeys and churches, some of whom became landowners on a grand scale. This is the Dún of Invernochty in Bellabeg near Strathdon, one of the best examples of a surviving Norman-style motte of the late 12th century and a potent symbol of early Scottish feudalism. The motte was constructed from a natural glacial mound with a surrounding deep moat which was filled with water from a nearby lochen and controlled by a sluice gate. On the summit here, a large wooden tower was erected, surrounded by a defensive wooden palisade. But archaeological excavations have revealed that the palisade was replaced at some point by a stone curtain wall, one of the earliest examples of stone Norman fortifications anywhere in Scotland. But this impressive motte and bailey was not the fortified seat of power of a Norman lord. Invernochty was the power centre of the Gaelic Earls of Mar, one of the Morivers of the Kings of Alba. The Earl embraced the new feudal ideas because they were in his interests. The transition to feudal tenure in Mar gave the Earl a legal title over land he controlled and the right to pass it on to his eldest son through the new practice of primogeniture. In return, the Earl pledged allegiance to the king and agreed to provide military support. Early motte and bailey castles like Invernochty are a declaration of local and regional status and power. But some feudal castles were more equal than others. This remarkable ruin is Kildrummy Castle. It replaced the motte at Invernochty as the principal seat of power of the Earls of Mar. Construction work was begun in 1252 by the Earl William, the King's Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a key role in the King's household, responsible for his finances. Everything about Kildrummy is a statement of power power over land and power over people. And feudal power on this scale was played out not only here in Mar, but on a national stage. The great earldoms and lordships like Mar played a central role in the government of the whole country. Land was the currency of power. Scottish feudalism developed slowly. In the Gaelic West, where native nobles predominated, pre-feudal ideas which emphasised a community's hereditary right to land, known in Gaelic as duchas, coexisted with the gradual spread of feudal charters. It was probably not until the 16th century that feudal charters covered all the land in the West Highlands. Even then, the role of the lord as the defender of clan interests and military leader maintained the importance of kinship links. In the south and east, where Norman and English knights settled in far larger numbers, feudal ideas took deeper root much more quickly. Even here, historians suggest that feudalism had to take account of local kinship and community allegiances. The great landowners were paternalists, providing military protection and using their command of agricultural resources to assist particular communities in times of hardship or stress. Feudalism also created a new category of landowner, the royal borough. Royal boroughs were towns which had been given extra privileges to hold markets and to trade, and some were also granted land. Here in Aberdeen, the borough was granted land by Robert the Bruce in the Charter of 1319. Today these are known as the city's freedom lands. But the lands had to be paid for, and the council gave a significant annual sum or fee to the monarchy. The freedom lands were anything but free. The town council continued to pay a symbolic amount up until 1986. The fact is that wherever land was granted out or devolved or shared under feudalism, it was always in the interests of the feudal lord. The introduction of feudalism into Scotland had a profound long-term impact on the way in which land was controlled. Before feudalism, control of land had been a consequence of the authority exercised over the people who lived on it. In contrast, feudalism established the principle of control over the land itself. Over time, feudalism adapted to changing circumstances. The Scottish monarchy gave up most of its land holdings, as did the church. Ties of military service to landowners and clan chiefs were severed, first in the Scottish borders and later in the Highlands as a consequence of the failure of the Jacobite rebellions. Ties and obligations of kinship and clan were gradually extinguished as landowners increasingly ran their estates as commercial enterprises. The pattern of concentrated land ownership, however, remained. In 1771, for example, the whole of the county of Aberdeenshire was owned by just 250 individuals. And in its largest parish of Crathy and Braemar, in the mid-19th century, there were just 5 landowners in a population of over 1,700. For much of the 19th century, it has been estimated that there were only 1,500 landowners in the whole of Scotland. By the end of the 18th century, most landowners were receiving their rents in cash. In addition to rents, however, tenants faced an endless list of impositions and controls. Some of them dated back to the early years of feudal tenure, with some tenants still thralled to the landowner's mills, in other words, restricted to using the laird's mill. On many estates, tenants had to assist the landowner with the harvest, cut his peats, and carry out bridge and road repairs. When landowners introduced new tax or leases at this time, they often imposed new conditions on the tenants. There were increasing restrictions on where livestock could be pastured, and access to forest resources was restricted. In some estates, tenants were even fined for collecting fallen wood. On the west coast, kelp production, which was becoming increasingly profitable, became an estate monopoly. In the second half of the 18th century, some Highland landowners started to increase their rents significantly. For some tenants, this was the final straw. There was a wave of emigration from parts of Skye, from Argyll, Glenelg and Knoydart. This early wave of emigration was opposed by many Highland landowners who were worried about the loss of labour resources and rental incomes. They petitioned the government to try and restrict or halt it. In response, the government passed the Passenger Vessels Act in 1803. While this aimed to make passage safer on emigrant ships, its underlying purpose was actually to restrict emigration by increasing its costs. And it succeeded. The initial wave of emigration dried up. By the middle of the 18th century, the increasingly lavish lifestyles of many landowners could not be funded simply by raising rents from existing tenants. The financial problems faced by many landowners, particularly in the Highlands, led to the sale of many estates. In Morvern between 1813 and 1838, every single landed estate changed hands. Many Highland estates were now purchased by new kinds of landowners, businessmen, merchants and financiers with no traditional links to their estates or the people living on them. From the end of the 18th century in both Highland and Lowland Scotland, landowners embarked on what was called the policy of improvement. In the Highlands, one of the central features of this policy was the conversion of traditional multi-tenant townships into sheep farms. Large-scale sheep farms run by small numbers of shepherds from the south were discovered to be far more profitable than township rents. The previous opposition by landowners to emigration evaporated as the benefits to estate balance sheets of large-scale removals of tenants became clear. As a result, whole communities in many areas of the Highlands were cleared from the land and replaced with sheep. The most notorious clearances in the Highlands were the large-scale removals carried out in areas like Strathnaver, the Strath of Kildonan and the Greenyards in Strathcarron. These clearances were marked by the violent coercion of residents. Even smaller scale clearances like that at Arrychonan in Argyll in 1848, when the landowner Malcolm of Poltallach cleared 50 residents, could produce violence and arrests when the tenants resisted eviction. Some cleared tenants were resettled elsewhere on the estates. Some of the biggest landowners, like the Duke of Sutherland and the Duke of Gordon, spent considerable sums of money building planned villages to house former tenants who were required to work on the estates. But many more were forced to emigrate, and some were effectively coerced into boarding emigrant ships bound for Canada and other colonial destinations. Feudal land laws, which had given power over the land to the individuals who owned it and disinherited the communities who lived and worked in it, provided the legal justification for these clearances. Clearances in the lowlands have been studied in much less detail than in the Highlands, but current research by historians suggests that even larger numbers may have been cleared from lowland Scotland. Many of these removed found work in the emerging industrial towns and cities of southern Scotland and in the textile towns of the Scottish borders. But in contrast to the Highlands, there seems to have been no large-scale emigration from the lowlands at this time. This is Gleneye near Braemar in Upper Deeside, which once formed part of the earldom of Mar. The bright green vegetation among the managed heather moorland is the legacy of centuries of transhumance and generations of subsistence farming. But there have been no farms in Gleneye for almost 2 centuries. The tenants and their families who lived here, numbering around 50 people, were cleared in 1843 by their landlord James Duff, the Earl of Fife. The glen became part of his vast sporting estate. Like many of the other deserted glens in Upper Deeside, Gleneye initially developed as a shealing area. Shealings like this one, the Rúia Dú, shealing of the black cattle, were the summer homes for people from further down the strath who pastured their cattle here and at an area known locally as the Meadow further up the glen and on the surrounding hills. Over the years, the fertilisation of the soil by generations of cattle made farming here viable. Some of the shealing sites were transformed into small subsistence farms. Stones were removed from the fields. Head dikes were built to enclose the arable land. Drainage ditches were dug and houses and outbuildings constructed. Corn and lime kilns were used and probably shared with neighbouring settlements. 6 farms existed here in the early 19th century. This is the farm known as Alt Slat. It's named after the burn which runs into the River Eye just over here. In the 1820s, the farmer was John Mackintosh, who paid an annual rent of £18. One of the highest in the glen. This enclosure is probably the stackyard where stooks of barley and oats were stored prior to being dried on a nearby corn kiln. After the grain was dried in the kiln, it was taken down the glen to Mill of Invereye, where Mackintosh and all the other tenants were obliged by the terms of their lease to have their grain milled. The original name for this settlement was Dalriata and Alba. The name suggests a wet woodland area, but the Dalriata indicates that this farm also started life as a shealing. The 2 tenants and their families who lived here were cleared in 1843. Their names were William and Malcolm Lamont. William Lamond was subsequently employed as a gamekeeper and moved to a new house at Acherry just across the river, where Charles McCarthy, the tenant, had just been cleared. William Lamond was the only resident to remain in Gleneye, and with the exception of Acheri, none of the other settlements was ever reoccupied. After Gleneye was cleared, a shooting lodge now in ruins was built at Altanor at the head of the glen. The Mar deer forest, comprising Gleneye and other glens, was leased to the Duke of Leeds for an annual rental of £1,200. The land around the settlements and the surrounding hills became pasture not for black cattle, but for red deer. The clearance of Gleneye and other glens like it destroyed the pastoral economies and replaced it with sporting estates. Pastoral economies had relied on a community's access to a wide range of resources. This was now replaced by a monoculture dominated by the hunting obsessions of the very rich. At the start of the 19th century, 6 deer forests were managed for hunting in Scotland. In 1900, there were over 160. By 1912, 20% of Scotland's land area was given over to deer forest. Many shooting tenants from the south could use the improved transport links to travel to the Highlands for the shooting season. The addition of driven grouse shooting increased the number of visitors to shooting estates. This led to the pattern of land use that still dominates many areas of upland Scotland. Almost 15% of Scotland's land surface continues to be managed as heather moorland. The traditional image associated with the clearances is a deserted and ruined black house surrounded by sheep. But in some areas of the Highlands, a more appropriate image is of a deserted shieling set among the hills and mountains of the grouse moor and the deer forest. The Highland clearances have always provoked profound debate. Apologists for the clearances have called them an unfortunate but necessary reaction to a traditional economy in crisis. But the clearances were not the inevitable outcome of the problems of farming in upland areas of the Highlands. The clearances were the result of the fact that the responses to these problems were drawn only from the narrow interests of landowners and not from the experience and ingenuity of the mass of the people who lived and worked on the land but didn't own it. The impact of the clearances in the Highlands went far beyond Scotland. It's one of the most bitter ironies of Scottish history that when dispossessed Scottish emigrants settled in Canada, Australia and other British colonies, they directly contributed to the clearance of native people from their lands. As public and government concern about the clearances grew, the Napier Commission was established in 1882 to review and make recommendations on land tenure. In 1886, security of tenure was given to tenants in a limited number of designated crofting counties. the Crofters Act was the first piece of legislation to significantly limit the powers of land ownership. There have, of course, been major changes in the pattern of land ownership since Victorian and Edwardian times. Security of tenure has been extended outside the crofting counties. National bodies like the Forestry Commission are major landowners, and more people in Scotland own land than before. A small but growing number of community land purchases is beginning to challenge the existing models of ownership. Today, Scotland has embarked on a process of land reform, which aims to establish transparency of ownership, increase the number of landowners, and promote more community ownership. But supporters of land reform claim that the pace of change is still too slow, and that nothing in current legislation is guaranteed to challenge the concentrated pattern of ownership that continues to exist and which most other European countries dispensed with years ago. A recommendation by the Land Reform Review Group that the amount of land that could be privately owned in Scotland should be capped was rejected by the Scottish Government. The history of land ownership in Scotland is mostly a dismal one. Over the centuries, the vast majority of Scots were excluded from land ownership and had little or no say in how land was managed or used. Today, the language of private land ownership can be full of glossy terms like stewardship and managing the land for community benefit. But we know that it's actual ownership that confers power, and this remains concentrated in far too few hands. In 2000, a major controversy arose over the ownership of the Cuillin mountain range on Skye. Clan Chief John MacLeod of Dunvegan claimed it as his private property and planned to market the mountains in order to pay for repairs to Dunvegan Castle. A legal ruling confirmed MacLeod's ownership based upon a charter from the Scottish monarchy in 1611. In the event, the sale did not go ahead. Standing on the Cuillin Ridge, the idea that any land on this scale anywhere in Scotland could be the property of one individual and sold to another just seems preposterous. Land has always been a natural and a common resource. It underpins the spiritual and material lives of communities. Although there is no going back to some golden age of Celtic communalism, if it ever existed, land reform will only move forward if we understand and honour our past.